Hello classes. This video goes over our Romantic era theme of identifying the self essay test and the works of literature that go along with it. The test on Unit 5, Romantic Era and the theme of identifying the self, will be an essay test of 2 to 3 handwritten pages. Wide rule paper, loose leaf, black ink pen. Virtual students and quarantine students may type these essays 1 to 1.5 full type double-spaced pages, 12 font should be sufficient. You are to choose one of the 8 characteristics of Romanticism and 2 of the works of literature specified that discuss the theme. I've given you 3 works of literature. You pick any 2. Most of the works below are actually from the Romantic era. Our editors also include 2 modern writers, Woolf and Proust. So the 8 characteristics of Romanticism that I've chosen are love of the power of nature, and the suggested works are Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey by Wordsworth, Ode to the West Wind by Percy Shelley, and Apostrophe to the Ocean by Lord Byron. Number 2, Desire for Personal Freedom, and the 3 works of lit, and again you pick 2 of the 3. The 3 works of lit, you may choose if you like number 2, Ode to a Nightingale by Keats, Ode to the West Wind by Percy Shelley, or From Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Criticism of Society is number 3, and the 3 works of lit I've chosen are The World is Too Much With Us by Wordsworth, London 1802 by Wordsworth, and From Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Number 4, Seeing Nature as a Retreat from Troubles. A, Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey by Wordsworth, B, Ode to a Nightingale, and D, Apostrophe to the Ocean. 5, Feeling Isolated from Society and a Desire for Solitude. A, Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey, B, Ode to a Nightingale by Keats, and G, From Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Number 6, Emphasis on one's memory and feelings, not logic and reason. A, Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey by Wordsworth, E, The World is Too Much With Us by Wordsworth, G, From Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. 7, Glorifying the Past or Remembering the Past Fondly. A, Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey by Wordsworth, F, London 1802 by Wordsworth, or I, The Madeleine by Proust. And then 8, Poetry or prose written in a more conversational, informal, sometimes stream of consciousness narrative structure. A, Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey by Wordsworth, H, From Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, or I, The Madeleine by Proust. So as you can see from all of those, that the most common poem or work of literature that fits most all of these is Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey. So unless you pick number 2, Desire for Personal Freedom, or 3, Criticism of Society, probably it'd be a good idea to pick Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey as one of your 2 works that you choose for the others. So we're going to take a look at Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey specifically in this video, and then in a few other videos we're going to go through some of the other works of literature as well, just as a review. So on page 555 of your textbook, we have Wordsworth introducing this poem that was written 5 years after he had once visited the Wye River Valley in the border between England and Wales. Before, he was running away from his troubles, and he happened upon the place he really wasn't looking for it. And it encouraged him. It renewed his spirit. It renewed his soul, because he had just been to France to witness the French Revolution, and it had not gone well for him. So he'd come back to England, and he's taking a walking tour of that region. And this place of the Wye River Valley, it may be called Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey, but the Tintern Abbey church is never mentioned in the poem. It's the countryside around that area that he talks about. But now it's 5 years later, and he's taking his sister Dorothy to see the place. And she's never seen it before. And when he gets there, it's like, well, it's okay. It's nice. I remember this, and I remember that, and I remember that. But the excitement that he once had 5 years ago is just not there anymore. Because he realized the place hasn't changed at all. He has changed. He has matured. He's a little bit older. He has a different perspective than he used to have. But he hopes he can recapture in his sister's eyes a little bit of that excitement that he once had. So he says, 5 years have passed, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters. And again I hear these waters rolling from their mountain springs with a soft inland murmur. Once again do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs that on a wild secluded scene impress thoughts of more deep seclusion, and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. The day has come when I again repose here, under this dark sycamore, and view these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts, which at this season with their unripe fruits are clad in one green hue, and lose themselves mid groves and copses. Once again I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines of sportive wood run wild, these pastoral farms green to the very door, and wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among the trees, with some uncertain notice, as might seem of vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods, or of some hermit's cave, where by his fire the hermit sits alone. In that hermit image is found in quite a bit of Romantic age poetry, the idea of getting away from society, going off by yourself, and living in nature. So these Romantic poets would later influence the American poets that we call the transcendental poets. Emerson and Thoreau and, well, Hawthorne to some degree, Emily Dickinson, Walt Whitman, all of those poets were encouraged by these Romantics and actually knew some of them as well. And so he says in the second paragraph, but it's a stanza, it's a poem, so it's more like a verse paragraph, because this reads a lot more like an essay than it really does a poem. And so that lends itself, of course, to number 8 on our sheet, poetry or prose written in a more conversational, informal, sometimes stream of consciousness narrative structure. So it does fit that quite well. These beauteous forms, through a long absence, have not been to me as is a landscape to a blind man's eye, but oft in lonely rooms amid the din of towns and cities. I have owed to them in hours of weariness sensations sweet, felt in the blood and felt along the heart. So as he has thought about this place over the last 5 years, it wasn't as if he couldn't remember it. He could remember it very well. So he says it wasn't like a blind man thinking about a place. He said, I really did remember it, and it really did help to encourage him. On page 556, he thinks about himself 5 years ago. He said, I was more like a man flying from something that he dreads than one who sought the thing he loved. For nature then, the coarser pleasures of my boyish days, and their glad animal movements all gone by, to me was all in all. I cannot paint what then I was. The sounding cataract is a waterfall, haunted me like a passion. The tall rock, the mountain, the deep and gloomy wood, their colors and their forms, were then to me an appetite, a feeling and a love that had no need of a remoter charm. So 5 years ago, he didn't overanalyze, well, the way he's doing this time. And so they were what they were. They were beautiful scenes of nature. He liked them. But now it's 5 years later, and he's analyzing a lot more. He's thinking more deeply about things. He has changed. The place hasn't changed, but he has changed quite a bit. But he realizes that even though he is different than he was 5 years ago, he's glad for the differences. Bottom of page 556 going on to 557. Not for this faint eye, nor mourn nor murmur, other gifts have followed. For such loss I would believe abundant recompense. For I have learned to look on nature, not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, which he was 5 years before, but hearing oftentimes the still sad music of humanity, nor harsh nor grating, though of ample power to chasten and subdue. And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man a motion, and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. Therefore am I still a lover of the meadows, and the woods, and the mountains. And so anything now that he thinks about in nature kind of reminds him about people. So as a philosopher, he's turning his experiences into a personal philosophy, that nature is there. Wordsworth wasn't necessarily the churchiest person in the world, but he saw God within the created world. And so to him, the created world is a very holy thing. Later on in the poem, he even calls himself a worshiper of nature. He didn't mean that literally, but he does mean he has tremendous respect for the power of nature in how it helps him interpret life and humanity, and even his own future. On page 557, going on to 558, he addresses his sister, hoping that she will feel some of the excitement that he felt when he saw this before. And also, he says that this will be a good memory for her, a memory of her brother and of this vacation that they took together. On page 558, therefore let the moon shine on thee, he's talking to his sister, in thy solitary walk, and let the misty mountain winds be free to blow against thee. And in after years, when these wild ecstasies shall be matured into a sober pleasure, when thy mind shall be as a mansion for all lovely forms, thy memory be as a dwelling place for all sweet sound and harmonies, oh then, if solitude, or fear, or pain, or grief should be thy portion, with what healing thoughts of tender joy wilt thou remember me, and these my exhortations. So just as this place has encouraged him over the last many years, he hopes his sister will also be encouraged by this place. And someday it will be a fine memory for her as she thinks about not only the Wye River Valley, this area around Tintern Abbey, but also as she thinks about her own brother.